Welcome back to Learn Law with Hannah. Today we are going to talk about the AO1, so the factual content for duress by threats. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as duress of threats or duress by threats. It doesn't really matter. It's very structured as a topic, which is great. We love structure. Just as an introduction, I would say duress by threats is a full defence. What does that mean? Well, if you are successful, then it leads to a full acquittal. Burden is on the prosecution. So you say in court, you, the defendant, say, I didn't want to commit the crime. I had a horrible choice to make. The choice was commit the crime or suffer death or serious injury. And the prosecution have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you were not acting under duress. A.G. Whelan is the starting point for duress by threats. A.G. Whelan says it's threats of immediate death or serious personal violence so great as to overbear the ordinary powers of human resistance. Okay, so let's break it down. I would say let's do it in 6 key parts. And just remember, I've got to talk about 6 things. What is the law? And then let's apply it to a scenario question. Number 1, who does the threat have to be to? So, very simple. It has to be to you, the defendant, or others. What is meant by others? Others means people close to the defendant. Case example, Wright. She imported drugs because she said she and her boyfriend were threatened. Trial judge said others means family, but then on appeal, they extended it to be people close. So number 1, who is the threat to? The defendant or others, which is people close to the defendant. Element number 2, what is a serious threat? Valderrama Vega confirmed that the threat has to be one of death or serious injury. Now, serious injury is physical harm, not mental harm. In Valderrama Vega, they threatened to disclose the fact that the defendant was gay and that he was bankrupt. By itself, that is not a serious threat. But if it is mixed in with threats of death and serious violence, then you can look at the cumulative effect. So the threat must be death or serious physical violence. Okay, element number 3, there has to be a connection between the threat and the crime. Well, what does this mean? This basically means that the defendant must have been told by the threatener, you need to go and rob the bank. You know, they have to actually nominate the crime. So the case of Cole, he was just threatened with death and serious injury that he had to pay back the money to a loan shark. However, the loan shark didn't specify how he had to do this. What crime did he have to commit? So he decided to rob, I think he robbed a bank or building societies. So the principle from Cole is there has to be a direct connection between the threat and the crime. Element number 4, the threat must be immediate. Now, what is meant by immediate? Abdul Hussein said immediate means imminent in the sense that the threat is hanging over you. And they hijacked a plane in Abdul Hussein. Hudson and Taylor, they were very sympathetic towards the 2 defendants who committed perjury in court. However, these days I would go with the case of Hassan. So, case of Hassan, House of Lords said, if there's an opportunity to go to the police, then you must do so. Element number 5, this is the Graham test. Now, all these elements have to be satisfied in order for you to have duress by threats. Graham test is in 2 parts. It's a subjective and an objective test. So the subjective test is from the defendant's point of view. Did the defendant act because they feared death or serious injury if they didn't commit the crime? Objective, would a sober person of reasonable firmness with the defendant's characteristics have acted in the same way? So it's objective, but we have actually added in defendant's characteristics. Now, what is meant by the term characteristics? The case of Bowen deals with characteristics. Mr. Bowen had a very low IQ, 68, and he was especially vulnerable to threats. But the court held that low IQ, being timid, things like that is not a characteristic to take into account. Relevant characteristics, so things that are going to make you probably more susceptible to threats include age, so young or old people, pregnancy, gender, slightly controversial, does that mean women are more susceptible to threats? Mental and physical disabilities. So the courts would be more likely to allow you duress by threats if you have one of those characteristics. Final element, element 6, I kind of refer to this as limitations of the defence or to the defence. Self-induced duress. If you join a gang, the defence will not be available to you. So if you voluntarily join a gang, the case of Sharp said there is no defence. Hassan tightened up the law and said that there's no defence if you ought to have foreseen that there was a risk of being threatened with violence. Now, I would look out in scenario questions for things like the defendant is friends with a violent drug dealer. You might try and say, oh, but I didn't know they were going to be violent and threaten me. Case of Hassan is basically saying, well, you ought to have known. So self-induced duress is not a defence. If you voluntarily join a gang, it is not a defence. Then we have the issue of murder and attempted murder. The case of Howe says duress by threats is never a defence to murder. Essentially, you can't choose what your life over somebody else's. So Howe, never a defence to murder. And then Obiter, they said no defence to attempted murder. So this is a good case to use for judicial precedent because in the case of Gotts, he was the 16-year-old who his violent father said, please kill, I don't think he probably said please, but kill your mother, otherwise I will kill you. He stabbed her, she survived. So in Gotts, he was charged with attempted murder and they used the obiter from Howe and they said there is no defence of duress to attempted murder. So that is duress by threats. Great topic, really interesting cases, nice and structured. So hopefully that has helped. Please, if you haven't already done so, click subscribe and like this video.